Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to review the Netflix movie Hush. Really, I think this movie could have probably started something. Eventually, we start to see in this movie where there is to be a person who is to be deaf and mute, and that is kind of an interesting story to tell where we end up having this character who is to be a author of sorts, and it seems I think this movie kind of started off like certain kind of movies like this, where eventually someone is to break into some woman's house, and eventually she is to have some disability, or there is to also be like kind of that same variation with a an older man and a group of people trying to break into his house. So, and of course, he has a disability of some kind. So, because we have movies that I kind of think came after this, that is like the Michael Keaton movie Blindsided, or we end up having movies like Don't Breathe, kind of is to feel similar or to be just like this, but those characters, those main characters, are to have been blind instead of deaf. So it's slightly different. But really, it's just like the fact of like there have been kind of movies like this that have probably just done this kind of thing or kind of story or kind of approach just a little bit better. Go into finding a film called You're Next, where eventually we have this whole family that is going into this family reunion to eventually find out that there are arrows coming through their windows, and all of a sudden they end up trying to leave the house to eventually fall into this tripwire and be forced to go back into their house begrudgingly, and so on and so forth. To where you would have thought that this kind of villainous character would have came up with something a lot more than eventually what he comes up with, which is just kind of roaming around the house, just kind of waiting this out and kind of playing with his food before he eats it. Technically, uh, not quite sure exactly like this guy, I guess, doesn't really like have a motive. It's just to be some kind of random killing. I really wish that there would have been some kind of story with this character to just kind of be like, oh, this is the reason why he did this. This is a reason why this all happened. Maybe if they would even gone and done this sometime later and had this girl kind of in this police station, and they would have found out like, oh yeah, uh this is the reason why this guy did this, uh or something along those lines, that would have been a little bit more intriguing to just tie these characters in at the end here. So saying whether or not that this girl did get out of this alive or not, because they could have just had a whole police station to just tie this character in for whatever reason. So going into this film, like I would just say that uh like if you haven't heard of any of these other movies that I've talked about, and you just kind of went into this movie, you might go into this movie just kind of going like, okay, like also like look at the movie Strangers. Like this movie and The Strangers are kind of one and the same. You have this kind of character that is to consistently like roam through this person's house without them completely being aware, and then eventually at some point in time they finally are to present themselves and kind of tell them what's going on. I think this movie does copy and paste a lot from the movie The Strangers, and goes on to basically seem quite similar. Uh, so, with that said, go out of your way to find any number of other films that I've suggested, but I think that Hush is a decent enough film. Uh, Regardless of what I said about my little nitpick about, like, oh, well, I have to read. Like, I have to pause things quickly to understand portions of story. Like, I have, like, boo hoo for me, right? Um, But yeah, like I also like have heard like some people were to also have problems with this film, which I don't quite understand that, where it's just like, well, like if you probably have problems with this film, you would probably have films with the slasher genre in general. And so why are you going into any kind of slasher movie whatsoever? Uh, Eventually realizing that there might have been something that eventually you might not like about this, then just completely avoid the slasher genre in general. Um, I don't know. I don't know what's in people's minds or heads or whatever when they watch a film. Uh, but anyways, so uh, so going into this movie, I would say that this like if you haven't seen this before, because this is my second time around with this movie, like I would say that this is a good enough film to garner watching. But also realize that this is a slower paced movie than any of the other names of movies that I had mentioned. Um, Probably Strangers does have a slow build, but I think they get a lot more creative with what they do than this film. There are a lot more unsettling things that Strangers is to do compared to this one, and so yeah. So with that said, teeing it up, what is this movie about? So our main character Maddie is to be this author who is to be kind of left at this cabin to try and work to get to her next book. And so one of her friends is to drop by to just be like, well, hey, like, how about you come over to my house and eventually we'll just go and like watch a movie or something like that. And so the girl's like, sorry, gotta work. So eventually, here's also the goofy thing. So not only does like Hush not really kind of make sense as a title for this movie, they could have called it like Silence, or they could have called it like any number of things. Like they could have rationally like called it The Intruder, and I probably would have bought that much more than whatever this movie was called. Um, or whatever this Hush was called. So, uh, but the villainous character is just to be called the Man in this thing. They could have called him the Masked Entity or the Masked Man. Like going through like the rolling the credits, I would have just been like, okay, who is the man? Like like who is the man in this movie? That just doesn't quite make any sense. I think they should have called him like the Masked Man or something like that, to where it kind of defines his character at least a little bit more. But whatever. So he's just called the Man, weirdly. Anyways, so eventually the Man goes off and is to kill Maddie's best friend, and then is to eventually like notice that this girl is to be at home and not notice really much of anything because she can't hear anything. And so it's kind of an interesting perspective to eventually get like the actual sound part of it, but then to also get Maddie's side of things, where eventually she of course is to just kind of be without sound at some portions of this film. So it's kind of really fascinating to see both sides of things and to eventually see how this movie plays out. So yeah, so just kind of teeing it up, because really after this we get this long stretch of like the guy is outside, the girl is to eventually just kind of figure out that this guy is to eventually be outside, and then there's this kind of cat and mouse chase kind of going around. Uh, Maddie is to eventually try and figure things out. Like I would have kind of hoped that this woman would have had like a lighter in her house, because I think she could have possibly done a number of things with simply a lighter, and that's like the one thing that she doesn't have in this movie. which she like, man, you could have gone and done like a Molotov cocktail. You could have gone off and like created a flamethrower through like certain kind of sprays and a lighter. But we coincidentally don't have that in this movie. Like they could have written it in where Maddie at some point could have been a smoker at one point, but then she gave it up. Like that would have been a way to kind of like have this lighter in this scenario, because technically they were foreshadowing any number of things that eventually Maddie was eventually going to use to kind of combat this killer in this movie. So let's go into spoiler territory because like this is a hour and 20 some odd minute movie, and so let's get into spoiler time. It's about that time to spoil this movie. um so anyways, let's go into it. So Maddie is to be working on her book, and so all of a sudden, Sarah is to come on in and do what she ends up doing here, telling Maddie to just like, hey, you want to come over to my house? We'll have a movie. John will be over, and so Maddie's like, well, I'm working. So eventually, of course, Sarah is to get killed, and so then now we're in the scenario that we're in. So eventually, how this plays out is that the killer is to know that Maddie is to not hear anything. He's to kind of click kind of this knife onto her door and realize that she can't see anything. He even sneaks into the house and is to try to make noise, and she doesn't hear anything. And so eventually the killer goes and takes this woman's phone and is to just kind of walk out of the house. And so all of a sudden Maddie is to go on and like start trying to write her novel. She ended up also trying to call this guy Craig, and then realized that was a mistake, and then Craig started to call her. And so eventually Maddie is just like, well, I guess I'm like I guess I made a mistake there. So Maddie all of a sudden is to use her laptop and call a girl named Max. And so here's when we get this stretch of dialogue where Max is to tell Maddie that like, hey, like you're all alone, like out there. Like, how about you come back and live with me because I miss you. And Maddie is to tell Max that evidently she is set up for a dating site for the deaf, and there are only like a certain number of guys that are to be in this kind of area that she's in. And she's like, yeah, like they're all not really all that good of guys. So really just cementing that this girl doesn't have a boyfriend. And so so eventually we have Maddie, who is to consistently call her cat a B, a B word, just kind of making fun of her own cat. And because there's to be this stretch of dialogue where Maddie is to be talking to Sarah before she ends up dying, where like Sarah is trying to learn sign language and is to eventually continue to try to learn things from Maddie, and then Maddie is to eventually talk about her cat and how difficult she is. So eventually we have after Maddie is done talking to Max, eventually Maddie is just to be on her computer trying to like type up her story, and she's having writer's block right now, and she is just to be like blah blah blah, the end, money please. Like I thought that was funny. So to just try to wrap up her book, because evidently Maddie is to seemingly have or seemingly be a person who is to come up with several different kind of endings for how she is to try and end her book. There's several scenarios that are wrapped around her head, and she ended up telling Sarah this earlier, that she's just like having a difficult time trying to figure out the perfect thing of how to end this book. And Sarah was to read one of her other books, and so Maddie was to like tell Sarah, it's like, well, hey, like, keep this book because I have a dozen other of them. Because evidently this author, I guess, couldn't really sell her books all that well. So, like, she obviously must have published them, but maybe they didn't get very far. So, but I guess maybe she just did well enough to afford some house, I guess. So, uh, so all of a sudden, Maddie is to eventually go and type away at her computer. All of a sudden, she ends up getting this message, and so she's like, "Oh, who dat? New phone?" So, uh, Maddie all of a sudden clicks on this and is to see a cluster of pictures showing her kind of walking around her own house, and so she's like, "Oh, okay, something's going on here." So all of a sudden, Maddie is just to kind of look on the outside of her house to, of course, end up seeing this entity character who's just like, hey, it's like, I'm here. Like, I have your phone. And so Maddie's like, oh my God. Here's the problem that I have immediately with this character because of her house. Like, this woman has way too many glass doors in her house. Like, like you really have it to where this killer had picked the perfect house to easily and quickly break into, and he doesn't, because why? Like, this could have been over in like 30 minutes. Any other horror movie would have had this person probably be death number 2, and they would have moved on. But no, like, we have to take a whole entire movie to just stretch this thing out, where this guy goes after this woman, and this woman has so many like doors that this guy could easily break into, as well as seemingly any number of this house where this guy could have easily broke into this person's house. And this girl doesn't have a panic room set up or anything like that. It's not like the Jodie Foster movie where eventually we're going to have a panic room scenario. So, how this eventually is to play out is that uh, eventually Maddie is to kind of find this like writing tool, and she is to go and smear this thing onto this window, or onto, not to the window, the glass door. And so she ends up, because evidently this killer had knocked down her power, so like this girl can't even use her Wi-Fi to try and call out to somebody because she has no Wi-Fi. Maddie tries to go on and is to try to figure out what John and Sarah's Wi-Fi is, but she can't figure out the password. She's like, I don't know. So she ends up kind of being effed in that kind of way. But then the killer is also coming up with the same thought too, of like, well, maybe she's going to try and use someone else's Wi-Fi, but how will she know the password? So eventually Maddie is to scroll on this door and to turn on this light, and or this flashlight, not light in the house. Uh, Eventually the killer is to see this note on this door, this glass door, that ends up saying like, well, hey, like you can run along. I haven't seen your face, and like my boyfriend is coming soon. And so the killer is like, really? So the killer ends up going and taking his mask off and showing his face. And so Maddie is to eventually realize that, like, this guy realizes that this girl is deaf. So the killer is to ask Maddie, it's like, you can read my lips, right? And she is like, well, yeah. So she nods. And so he's like, okay, well, like, I know good and well that you don't have a boyfriend. Like, you say this here, but you're lying. because you just talked to your friend saying that you do not have one, so you're lying to me. So so eventually this guy is to kind of instill fear in Maddie, and so eventually now Maddie is just kind of scrambling to see what exactly she can use. It seems like this killer uh, is to have this crossbow, which I'm just like, okay, I can possibly see where like either this guy having a gun or a crossbow could eventually like seem much more threatening, much more so than if this guy just had a knife, because you have to have some kind of long distance weaponry for this kind of movie to really work. Like if this guy just had a knife on him, then like this movie would just be like, really? Like this woman could easily run away. Like what is this guy, like a dagger throwing expert? Man, wouldn't that be a film to just have like this dagger throwing expert, and like all he needs is like just these knives at his disposal, and he can just chuck and just take down anybody. Like what is this, like Jeepers Creepers 3? Because eventually that plays out like that. So yeah, so what eventually happens in here is we also have an early scene where Maggie was trying to cook something and she ends up burning uh, whatever the food was. And so we find out that it seems that Maddie's fire alarm system like is to be so like flashing lights and vibration and whatever to basically just shake up her house just in case Maddie was to ever like be sleeping during a time which her house accidentally is to burn down. So uh and we also had Maddie, who, when she has to go and kind of figure out some things that she has to use, she immediately goes for certain kind of aerosols or some kind of like spraying kind of thing, which eventually she ends up using later on in the film. So eventually, what ends up happening here is just like these two are just kind of waiting each other out. Maddie eventually is to scramble into this room and eventually try to put a dresser in front of her door, just to eventually find that it's obvious that the killer could find her, because she ends up going and adjusting these blinds in this specific room. And so what the killer ends up doing is he ends up taking Sarah's dead body and just kind of smacks her fingers against this window. And so we have, of course, Sarah now realizing her friend is dead, mourning the loss of her friend, and so she ends up leaving that room because she's like, oh my god, this is so horrific. So eventually we just have this killer just kind of like just seemingly roaming around, just kind of waiting it out. uh Maddie consistently keeps like adjusting throughout her house and is to try to figure this guy out. So eventually what happens is Maddie is to eventually go and find her keys for her car, and so she turns on the car alarm and lets that go for a while. And so the killer ends up going and trying to figure out a way to turn this fire alarm or car alarm off. And so eventually, like, Maddie is still just kind of stuck in her home trying to figure out what else she can do, what else she can use. So eventually what is to happen is Maddie is to uh, also come up with some kind of strategies to try to escape. She ends up kind of going underneath her porch outside and eventually kind of feeling the wood that's that's to be where this killer is to be walking around. And so Maddie is to possibly think that maybe she can scramble and run off when eventually she is to see this guy kind of heading another direction. So Maddie eventually tries to leave out of her house to eventually have to just scramble because she ended up getting a freaking arrow in the leg. So Maddie goes and climbs up this kind of what's the word? Uh, Kind of ladder esh like thing that she's to get up to her roof, and we end up having the killer end up following her up there. And so this guy is to conveniently go and take the crossbow and put it up there first, and Maddie is to grab on the crossbow and take this away from the killer. And so she ends up going into this room trying to arm up the crossbow, and she can't. I guess she's not strong enough, because when we're really looking at it, crossbows are actually really hard to be able to uh, kind of set up a lot. And like it all kind of comes down to like arm strength and stuff like that, where it's like you end up getting certain people that eventually even take up like bow and arrow kind of thing, and it doesn't come that easily because you have to have like certain arm strength to really pull this thing back. So like I think that would come out to be like a really perfect kind of villain weapon, like simply like a bow and arrow, because there's certain kind of bow and arrows that you like not everyone can easily use, because you have to be strong, really strong, to be able to like kind of take the rearing back fairly often. So the killer is to notice that Maggie is struggling trying to set up this crossbow, and he's like, yeah, I guess it's not so easy now, is it? So eventually, Maggie is to finally get one of these arrows set up, and this crossbow eventually prepped. So, but now all of a sudden, John is to arrive at this house. And so we end up having the killer who is to kind of eventually circle around when John is to try and knock on the door of Maddie to kind of make her aware of like, hey, where is Sarah? Like, she should be here by now. So eventually John is to see this guy with his flashlight, and John is like, okay, like whoever this guy is. So the killer is to supposedly say that he is to be some police officer, where it's like, okay, where's his badge? Where is his wallet that is to say his badge? Weirdly, we had the killer who was to ask for John's wallet, but you would have thought that John would have asked, like, hey, where's your badge? Let me, like, it seems like you're not wearing a uniform. It doesn't really seem like you're, like, it just seems that, like, we would have had this kind of resolved a lot quicker than kind of the slow pacing thing that both this killer and John make this out to be. So, uh, the killer is to mention that it's like, well, hey, like, yeah, this guy like kind of knocked me down, and like, good thing that you were here, or otherwise I would have probably been bleeding out all night. Uh, and so the guy was like, yeah, I guess it is a good thing that I'm here. And so when we had this like consistent transition of John and the killer kind of like passing certain items back and forth, all of a sudden we end up finding that Sarah's earring is to be falling onto the ground, making John realize that this guy is to not be who he says he is. So John is to mention to the killer, like, well, hey, like, I think Maddie is to have a key um, for this door in one of the rocks that are in here, like a little secret hidey ho kind of thing. So go ahead and just check in one of the rocks. Because the killer is to go and ask John for his phone so that way he can call this in. Because weirdly, this guy didn't have a phone on him, and like he couldn't figure out how to exactly call this in, because he's really garbagingly trying to figure out how to just come up with a way to get this guy's phone. So the killer ends up calling supposedly the police, and I'm like, well, that's kind of weird because he probably didn't really dial all that much. You would have thought that John would have come up with like, hey, like who did you dial? Like, did you just like randomly, like, did you just turn on the phone and then you just like pretended that you're calling somebody? Like, I would have also looked to see like if this guy was to actually be legitimately having the part of the phone that is to seemingly call someone. This does not seem legit. So John goes off and is to tell the guy about the key, and he's like, "Oh, thanks." And so the killer is to hold on to John's phone in his pocket, and so John is like, "Well, hey, am I gonna get that phone back?" And the killer is like, "Oh man, I'm sorry, it's a force of habit." So eventually, the killer goes and looks for this key, and all of a sudden, we have Maddie who's kind of banging onto this glass, trying to alert John, like, "Hey, he's a bad guy, he's the killer, he's whatever." And so that's when the killer comes in and slices John's neck, and so now like John is like losing blood heavily, and but he's still like trying to come up with some kind of defense. John falls over, and then the killer is like, "Well, hey man, thank God that Maddie arrived, because I wouldn't have been able to possibly take this guy down." Because he's so big. And like we end up having also the killer that is to just kind of mention that uh uh oh god, what was he to say here? There was some weird goofy thing that he was to say, like some funny thing. Uh I don't remember. Anyways, so like I had it and then I lost it immediately. Um so eventually John is to seemingly be dead, and so eventually we find out that John seemingly isn't dead, that he's to go and try to choke out the killer. And so we have quickly where Maddie is trying to come up with some kind of strategy. Like she's like, well, should I run? Like what should I do? Should I try and like come up with some kind of like she's rattling all these endings into her head. She ends up going off and doing this one ending that just ends up having her dead, and then we resume back in for her to just kind of rethink her strategy because Maddie is to come up with a solution. It's like, well, maybe I can run. And then all of a sudden, we end up seeing the killer who's running after her and goes and drops her onto the ground and kills her with some rock, bashes her head in. And then that's the one scenario that Maddie is to play into her head. So Maddie's to think, well, maybe I can hide. Well, eventually she's realizing that eventually she's going to somehow or another bleed out, and that's a mistake. So eventually, the only solution that Maddie comes up with is she now has to kill this guy and has to come up with some kind of plan. Because eventually, John is to try to choke out this guy, but eventually he loses all the blood in his body and dies off. So the killer is to eventually kind of go and kind of check John's pockets to find out that he's a cigarette smoker. So the killer ends up lighting up a cigarette to eventually find this cat. And so, like, the killer is kind of distracted with this cat. So eventually we have Maddie who is to finally make a defense. And so she ends up going and taking a crossbow and shooting the killer into the shoulder. And so the killer ends up pulling this, of course, arrow out. So now eventually we have Maddie who is trying to like scramble to get back into her house. So we end up having this back and forth of Maddie consistently trying to like she ends up leaving the house, she comes back to the house, leaving the house, come back to the house, so on and so forth. There's to be this one part where eventually there's to be this whole like window situation where eventually Maddie is to like be closing this window uh, on the killer, and the killer is trying to open it, and then Maddie gets his hammer and stabs the killer in the arm with his hammer, and so he then has to kind of like wrap up this injury, and so eventually Maddie is to go on and just be like, well, okay, maybe I'm just gonna go and hide into my bathroom and just kind of like just wait here for a while and maybe see that this guy eventually bleeds out before she does, kind of thing. So eventually what happens here is that uh, the killer ends up breaking into I guess these one windows that are to be somewhat by this bath, and he ends up slipping inside where the bath is, coincidentally right behind Maddie. And so all of a sudden, like the killer is to just kind of like start to talk and have a thing of dialogue, and is to be breathing heavy. And so all of a sudden, Maddie is to realize that this killer is to, of course, like be behind her. And so conveniently, as choreographed, this killer ends up going and taking this blade and is going to like stab into Maddie. But Maddie, coincidentally, simultaneously at the perfect time, turns and goes and stabs the killer instead, and then tries to run off. And so because eventually the killer is to have finally, after this whole kind of waiting it out, the killer is to finally just tell Maddie that he's coming in. And so eventually Maddie, after breaking her arm, because the killer was to eventually just kind of smash this sliding door onto Maddie's hand, breaking her hand and crushing it. Uh, Maddie eventually goes and tells him, like, do it, coward. Uh, like she writes it in her own blood. So eventually now Maddie is kind of making it into another part of her house, and the killer is to be following her. So eventually Maddie is to wait it out in the kitchen for the killer to arrive, just for her to call her some awful name, of course. So Maddie eventually is to take this wasp spray and splash this wasp spray onto, of course, this guy's eyes. I'm like, well, like, could have done that earlier. Could have really just done that earlier, but I guess that's just me. Um, like, really, that could have made this movie end a lot quicker, but again, that's just me. Like that whole like window thing could have easily like created a perfect window for Manny to have sprayed this into this guy's eyes instead of taking and doing this whole hammer bit. So, because this girl should have had like a cluster of weapons at her disposal, but she only had the hammer at that perfect time. So, eventually, what ends up happening is also Maddie is to use this fire alarm that she was to have as this kind of disorienting agent, to now have it be like that this alarm is so loud that the killer is kind of like putting his hands onto his to his ears because the alarm is so loud. So, and I'm just like, wait a minute, how is it that this alarm is technically going off? There is no fire, but I guess Maddie couldn't figure out how to turn it off. But still, I'm just like, this doesn't seem all that quite like thing to have made sense with any of this, but whatever, I guess. So eventually, Maddie is to go on and is to now be struggling with the killer, and there's to be this one position where the killer is to be choking Maddie. Maddie is to seemingly be so close to this corkscrew like uh, weapon, and I'm like, wait a minute, like this woman has a corkscrew thing, but she doesn't have any wine bottles. Like, why doesn't she have any wine bottles? Like, she could have easily just broken any number of these bottles over this guy's head, because if she has cork thing, like she would have like that's just the assessment of me to just think of like she could have easily stabbed this guy. Like she could have break these things over this guy's head and then stabbed. Like you could have really just kind of taken this guy out via that. But like again, like stuff was to be of thought out of like in my head, just rattle around and think of ways that this girl could have ended this maybe sooner. But whatever. So What ends up eventually happening is Maggie is to start to slowly but surely see like flashes of her life before her, and we're almost assuming that Maggie is possibly going to die. But then all of a sudden, Maggie is to grab this corkscrew thing and eventually shove this into the killer's neck, and the killer ends up falling over. So Maggie is to go and dial 911, and then eventually the cops are to come, the day is saved. And so with that said, I think I've covered most of this movie, or at least the most possible important parts. I think anything else with this movie, I think I'm trying to think, rattle around in my head if I forgot anything, which I'm sure I did. uh I think there was one part where Maddie was trying to scramble to realize that her friend who had died possibly had a phone in her back pocket. Excuse me, my apologies uh, for that burp there. Ugh. Anyways, so Maddie was to go and find her friend's pocket, and that's when we get the whole window situation where eventually Maddie is to put a hammer uh, to eventually the killer's arm, and that happens quite early on in the film when eventually it happens right after the whole window situation where the killers to kind of bat the hands onto the window. Like shortly thereafter, that Maddie realizes that she has that opportunity to find hopefully a cell phone. And so yeah, I think that's all that I wanted to say about this movie. If there's any little small parts that I probably forgot about, not everything is to have been really 100% like the most important thing about this movie, but I know that there might be little details or something that slipped my mind. But in time, maybe eventually I will go back at this at some point, and because I really went all over the place with this one. Like I kind of like went back and like brought back certain other scenes and whatever throughout this one. So it's not like perfectly timed and whatever, but good enough. Like I could have really just skimmed this down into the most important parts, and then could have forgotten about a lot of other stuff. But uh, and could have made this like a 10-minute review because it's a pretty simple film. But with that said, I'm going to get out of here. Bye, buddy. Bye, buddy.